Most of us inherit a definition of success long before we're old enough to question it. When we're children, life seems surprisingly simple. The adults around us tell us what a successful life looks like, and because they've lived longer than we have, we naturally assume they're right. Study hard, go to university, find a stable job, build a family, retire. It's such a familiar story that we rarely stop to ask a simple question. Is this roadmap actually mine? Not because it's necessarily wrong, but because no one can tell you who you're going to become 20 years from now. No one can predict what kind of work will make you feel alive. No one can tell you which sacrifices will strengthen you and which ones will slowly begin to consume you. Looking back, I don't think I made the wrong decision. In fact, I think I made exactly the right decision. The problem is that I believed one decision could remain the right decision forever. I am a software developer, and if I'm completely honest with you, software development was never my dream. I wasn't one of those kids who spend afternoon building computers or writing little programs for fun. I wasn't fascinated by technology in a way that only a true enthusiast can be. I was able to understand and appreciate it for what it is, but I did not have the innate curiosity to discover how things work and why are they done the way they are, and so on. I wasn't obsessed with learning how software worked. Actually, if you had asked me what interested me most back then, programming probably wouldn't even have made the list. What attracted me were ideas, why people believe what they believe, whether morality depends on God, whether truth is objective, how we know anything with certainty. Those were the kinds of questions that kept me awake at night. Programming never did. Or when it did, it was for completely different reasons. So why did I become a software engineer? The answer is much less romantic than people usually expect. Growing up in a middle-class family, like many families, our valued stability, because financial stability meant freedom from worries that many people know all too well. And because around the time I had to decide what to study, the technology industry was exploding. Everywhere I looked, software engineering seemed to represent opportunity. Companies were hiring. People talked about programming as if it were one of the safest careers anyone could choose. So I looked at the options in front of me and I asked myself a practical questions. What decision gives me the highest probability of building a stable future? Not what am I passionate about? Looking back, I don't think that question was foolish. I actually think it was wise. At least it was wise with the information I had at the time. That's an important distinction, because one of the biggest mistakes we make is judging our past selves using information they couldn't possibly have known. The 18-year-old version of me wasn't trying to become rich, he wasn't chasing prestige, he simply wanted a stable life. And software engineering looked like the most reasonable path toward that goal. So I followed what I now think of as a traditional script. Study hard, get into university, find a good job, work hard, build a life. It seems responsible and perhaps most importantly, it seemed wise. But university quickly reminded me that making a rational decision doesn't make the journey easy. Programming did not come naturally to me. I wasn't one of those students who immediately understood pointers, memory management, recursion, or object-oriented design. There were lectures where I left with more questions than answers, assignments that took me far longer than I expected, moments where I genuinely wondered whether I simply wasn't wired for this kind of thinking. But every time that thought appeared, another one replaced it. Life isn't supposed to be easy. That sentence became almost a philosophy for me. I believed that adulthood required sacrifice, that meaningful things often demanded discipline before they become rewarding. And to be fair, I still believe that's true. One of the biggest lies our culture tells us is that if something feels difficult, it must be the wrong path. Sometimes difficulty is simply the price of learning something valuable. So I kept going. Slowly, almost without noticing it, something began to change. Not because programming suddenly became easy, it didn't, but because I stopped measuring success by how quickly I understood everything. Instead, I started enjoying the process of understanding. And that's when I discovered something that genuinely surprised me. It wasn't programming itself that fascinated me, it was, for the lack of a better word, debugging. I loved sitting in front of a problem that made absolutely no sense, reading through code, following one clue after another, forming a hypothesis, testing it, watching it fail, trying again. Eventually finding the one tiny mistake that explained everything. Looking back, I realized that debugging appealed to something much older in me. The same curiosity that made me interested in philosophy also made me enjoy investigating complex problems. In both cases, the process was remarkably similar. You begin with incomplete information, you ask questions, you eliminate possibilities, you change your own assumptions, and eventually, if you're patient enough, clarity emerges. That realization taught me something I didn't expect. Sometimes perseverance doesn't just make you stronger. Sometimes it introduces you to parts of yourself that you didn't know existed. If I had quit the moment programming became difficult, I never would have discovered that I actually enjoyed one of its most intellectually satisfying aspects. That lesson has stayed with me ever since. Sometimes life asks us to endure something long enough to reveal the unexpected gifts hidden inside it. Every lesson has another side, and that second lesson would take me several more years to understand. The interesting thing about life is that sometimes it doesn't tell you immediately when something is wrong. Sometimes everything looks exactly as you hoped it would. You graduate, you find a good job, you begin earning more money than you ever imagined you would as a student. On paper, all these things look good, everything is moving in the right direction. For a while, I genuinely believed it was. From the outside, my career was progressing exactly as I had hoped. But there was something happening beneath the surface that I didn't notice at first. It wasn't dramatic. There wasn't a single day where I woke up and thought, I don't want to do this anymore. It happened so slowly that I almost missed it. The first signs appeared outside of work. Or perhaps I should say they appeared in everything that happened after work. I would get home in the evening and finally have time for the things I actually wanted to do. I think about continuing one of my paintings. Sometimes I'd want to read theology. Other days I think about going to the gym or planning another trip. The desire was still there. Nothing had changed about what I loved, but something had changed about me. I no longer had the energy to give those things the attention they deserved. And I don't simply mean physical tiredness. That's normal. Most jobs leave you physically or mentally tired by the end of the day. What I experienced felt different. Software engineering doesn't always end when you close your laptop. The code comes home with you. Not literally, but mentally. You continue thinking about problems you couldn't solve. Your brain quietly searches for solution while you're eating dinner. You suddenly remember a possible explanation while you're taking a shower. You wake up with another idea. The solution might even come to you in a dream. Sometimes you solve a bug while you're nowhere near your computer. It's a strange profession in that sense. Even when you're resting, part of your mind often isn't. For a long time, I convinced myself that this was simply the price of having an intellectually demanding career. And perhaps to some extent it is. But eventually, I realized something that unsettled me. The problem wasn't that software engineering was difficult. The problem was that it demanded the very thing that every other passion in my life also needed: my attention, my curiosity, my mental energy. Those resources are finite. Every day I spent 8 or 9 hours solving technical problems. By the evening, the best part of my mind had already been spent. When I tried to paint, I wasn't creating with a fresh mind. When I wanted to think deeply about theology, I found myself struggling to focus. The tragedy wasn't that I had stopped loving those things. The problem was that they were receiving whatever was left of me. And that realization frightened me, because I began asking myself a question that had never occurred to me before. If my work consumes the very energy my deepest interests require, what happens after 10 years, 20, 30? I couldn't ignore the question anymore. Up until that point, I had always thought about sacrifices as something unquestionably good. You sacrifice comfort to build discipline. You sacrifice time to acquire skills. You sacrifice immediate pleasure for long-term stability. Those ideas are true. They're still true. Nothing I'm saying here should be understood as an argument against sacrifice. In fact, I think one of the biggest problems in modern culture is that many people give up far too quickly. We've almost started believing that if something isn't enjoyable within a few weeks, then it must not be our calling. Life simply doesn't work that way. Almost everything worth doing is difficult in the beginning. But while reflecting on my own experience, I realized something else. Sacrifice can quietly transform into something very different. It can become self-abandonment. At first, you're sacrificing something valuable in order to build something even more valuable. But if you never stop sacrificing, eventually there's nothing left to protect or to sacrifice. That's what I failed to understand. I kept assuming that because software engineering had been the right decision once, it had to remain the right decision forever. I never stopped to ask whether the reasons that justified the decision still existed. And that's when I realized something that has stayed with me ever since. A wise decision can become an unwise decision if the facts that supported it are no longer true. Not because the original decision was wrong, but because reality has changed. And wisdom isn't just the ability to make good decisions. Wisdom is the ability to recognize when yesterday's reasoning no longer matches today's reality. That was one of the hardest lessons I've ever learned, because admitting that a decision had reached its natural ends feels almost like admitting you were wrong. But they're not the same thing. Some decisions are meant to carry us through one chapter of life, not the entire book. There is one final realization that changed the way I think about almost every important decision I've ever made. For years, I've believed wisdom meant making the right decision. That's why I evaluated almost everything. Was this the right university? Was this the right career? Was this the right company? Was this the right opportunity? I imagine wisdom as something static, as if somewhere out there existed one perfect answer. And if you found it, my job was simply to remain faithful to it for the rest of my life. Today, I don't think wisdom works like that anymore. I think wisdom is much more alive than that. Because life has a strange way of revealing information that simply wasn't available when we first made our choices. The truth is, I enjoyed philosophy, I enjoyed theology, I had an interest in painting, I loved sports, but I didn't yet know how central those things would become to who I was. There are some things about yourself that can only be discovered by living. No amount of planning can replace experience. Some truths refuse to reveal themselves until you've lived with your decisions long enough. And I think that's exactly what happened to me. Software engineering gave me something incredibly valuable. It gave me stability, it gave me discipline. But while it was giving me those things, it was also teaching me something else. Something I wasn't ready to understand when I was 18. It was teaching me who I wasn't. And that's why I don't regret becoming a software engineer. Because this isn't a story about making a mistake, it's about outgrowing a decision that had already accomplished what it was supposed to accomplish. That was the key. Some decisions are bridges. You don't build a bridge because you intend to live on it forever. You build it because it allows you to reach the next part of your journey. For me, software engineering became that bridge. It carried me across one chapter of my life. But somewhere along the way, I forgot that bridges are meant to be crossed, not inhabited. In hindsight, I think there are two lessons that this chapter of my life taught me. The first is that discernment alone is not enough. Judgment is only as good as the information it's built upon. A perfectly logical conclusion drawn from incomplete information can still lead you in the wrong direction. When I was younger, I applied what I genuinely believed was good discernment. Given everything I knew at the time, software engineering was a wise choice. The problem wasn't my reasoning. The problem was that I continued applying the same conclusion even after the facts had changed. My understanding of myself had grown. My priorities had changed. My circumstances had changed. But my decision remained frozen in time. And wisdom requires something more difficult than making good decisions. It requires the humility to revisit them, the courage to admit that life has taught you something new. The second lesson is even more personal. I have come to believe that every human being has a certain nature or calling. Not in the sense that we're trapped by destiny, but in the sense that there are activities, questions, and way of living that resonate with us so deeply that ignoring them comes at a cost. You can silence them for a while, responsibilities can drown them out, fear can postpone them, success can even convince you that you're moved beyond them, but eventually they return. Because that is who you are, and in that sense, they are unavoidable. If there's one principle this chapter of my life has taught me, it's this. A wise decision made with incomplete knowledge isn't a failure. Refusing to consider it after you've learned something new about yourself might be. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.